Hello and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. As always, I'm your host, John DeLynn, and I'm here for part two of my interview with Brian Hales. Brian is the author of several books, but the books that we're going to be talking about today are three books that are set to release 6 days from the recording of this podcast on February 26, 2013. Greg Koford Books will be releasing a 3-volume series called Joseph Smith's Polygamy that deals with the history of Joseph Smith's polygamy and the theology of it. You can buy these books at Benchmark, Koford, and at Amazon. We encourage you to support these great books and to support Brian and Greg Koford Books. I'll also say, just for my good friend Lloyd, that Brian will be involved in 2 book signings on February 27th from 5:30 to 7:30 at Benchmark Books in Salt Lake City, and March 9th at 7 p.m. at Pioneer Book in Orem. Brian and I believe his researcher, Don Bradley, will also be in attendance to discuss and answer questions about this book. Just for our listeners, this is also a video presentation, which we're releasing on youtube.com/Mormon Stories, or you can probably get a link to it from mormonstories.org, the video portion. But there's 81 slides in this presentation that you'll be listening to today. So for those of you who are visual learners, want to see the visuals, you can either watch this on YouTube, watch the YouTube video on Mormon Stories, or we'll allow you to download the PowerPoint presentation, and you can have that for your reference. The only other thing I'll say before jumping in is that this is a 4-part series if you count the interview on athoughtfulfaith.org that the wonderful Sarah Collette did, which you can think of as a deep dive into Joseph Smith's polygamy. Sarah's a great interviewer. She's much more knowledgeable about this topic than I am, and she and Brian do a 2 to 3 hour deep dive. The second part is something Brian and I just recorded, which was a response to Grant Palmer's allegations of of sexual improprieties against Joseph Smith. We just recorded that. That's also available on YouTube and on Mormon Stories. You can watch that as well. This part 3 for the overall series is going to be dealing with the top 12 myths about Joseph Smith's polygamy. And then next week, we hope to record with Brian a final sort of episode on how Brian reconciles polygamy with his faith. So that's the overall part of the series. Brian Hales, welcome back to Mormon Stories.
Thank you, John. It's great to be back.
Thanks, Brian. I should also mention that Brian is a anesthesiologist who lives in the Salt Lake City area. But his, I think at least one of your books received the coveted John Whitmer Award for historical books. Is that right?
Yes, the book Modern Polygamy and Mormon Fundamentalism, The Generations After the Manifesto, received the 2007 Best Book Award from John Whitmer.
Yeah, and we love John Whitmer here on Mormon Stories Podcast, the John Whitmer Historical Association and John Amer and all the great people at the Community of Christ. So, all right, Brian, so I asked you to put this together because I want to do all we can to clear the air about what is and isn't factual about Joseph Smith's polygamy. Now, I guess I want to give a disclaimer similar to the one that I gave before, which is that none of us are ever going to know exactly what happened with Joseph Smith and polygamy and all the other things. I mean, all we have is the historical record and then people's, conversations and perceptions about what happened. What I like about Brian and other historians is that they put a heavy emphasis on the original historical documents upon which we have evidence to make claims about what did and didn't happen. So the purpose of this episode isn't to prove to people the church is true, to sort of prove what did or didn't happen. It's just to say, if we're going to talk about polygamy, let's have our conversation be based on the historical record. Is that fair, Brian?
Yes, I think if we, and I said this in the last interview, that if we stay close to the evidence, everybody wins. We may not agree, and we'll talk a lot about that as we talk about these myths and what defines a myth. But I think if we stay with the evidence, everybody will win, even if we don't agree.
All right. So on the screen now is the full list of the 12 myths regarding Joseph Smith's polygamy. I'm not going to read them all ahead of time. Maybe I don't think we should. Our listeners can pause the video if they want to. But why don't we go ahead and dive in to the first point? Does that sound okay?
Yeah. And I just put that there to let people know where we're going. And for those who are just listening, we'll try and include enough description here so that you won't be missing out completely. The slides just give you some comprehensive overviews of several of the topics that we're dealing with. So the first myth, and let me just do my own disclaimer as we talk about these myths, I'm interjecting my own judgment, and not everybody's going to agree with my reading of the evidence, and I respect that. So when I say that this is a myth, I'm just saying I've seen all the evidence, and this is my conclusion. Keep in mind, I am a believer, and so there are others, because the evidence is not conclusive in every case. There are some of them where it's far more conclusive than others, and if people want to disagree, that's just fine. And for heaven's sakes, if somebody has evidence that's pertinent and I've missed it, please let's get that out there. But the first myth is that Joseph Smith had a reputation as a womanizer. And Gerald and Sandra Tanner, they wrote in their book on Joseph Smith and polygamy, which actually is quite a remarkable collection of data on this topic. And it was published in the 1970s. They don't have a copyright date in the book. But anyway, they said the charge of sexual immorality was probably one of the most frequent charges made against Joseph Smith. And I would argue that is just not supported by the evidence. Certainly, it would be supported by things that were said about Joseph after his death. But as we discussed in the last interview, if you look at the evidence between Joseph's birth and 1842 is when John C. Bennett came out with all of his propaganda, what we discover is there's only one published allegation against Joseph Smith, and that's the Levi Lewis one, which I judge to be very dubious. And then you have some private writings around the time of Fanny Alger, which can be read either way as a plural marriage or as adultery. And then that's all that I've been able to find.
So what's this big table that you have here after the Gerald and Sandra Tanner quote?
If you go to my website, you will find that, and when I started with my research and I hired Don Bradley to help me, I just said, we want to get every single account of anything dealing with this topic, Joseph Smith and plural marriage. And even if it's an accusation of fornication, adultery, or if it's documentation of a marriage, everything. And as I've gone through all of these, I've identified certain allegations against Joseph Smith, and I've classified there. I found, if I think I remember correctly, 54 of them, if you want to count Fanny Alger and things. But some of them are reports that he had sexual relations with non-wives, and there's 9 reports of polyandrous sexuality. There's 16 reports of immoral proposals. But anyway, if you go to my website, you could look at all of this. And quite honestly, when you get that many things out there, and somebody somewhere said that Joseph was involved with some improper behavior involving marriage and or sexuality, and there's 54 of them, most people are going to look at this and say, whoa, where there's smoke, there's fire, at least one of them is going to be true. And so when I uploaded this, I thought, should I really be doing this? Because I have analyzed every single one of them, and you can go to the website and click on any of these names, and it'll come up with the original evidence. I'm not pulling any punches here, the original statements, and then I do my own analysis. And I don't think any of them are credible, which is a remarkable conclusion, but I would invite anybody to go to them and or others if I've missed them, and I'm sure that I have, and then bring it on and let's discuss it if they think there is something credible. But what's interesting, if you look on the fourth column over, or fifth actually, there's some dates there, and this all of these accusations, there's only one, the very top one, that's 1834. And then there's nothing until 1842, and then all of the other ones are printed by John Bennett. So if you took Bennett out in Joseph Smith's lifetime, these accusations, the only one that was printed during his lifetime is Eliza Winters that we talked about in the last evaluation or the last interview. And then if you throw Bennett in there, you can get 4 or 5 more. But Joseph did not have a reputation of being a womanizer based on the evidence that I've been seeking to find.
So, Brian, right off the bat, I don't mean to slow you down, but as I'm looking at this list, you're on the one hand trying to make the point that Joseph Smith didn't have a reputation as being a womanizer, and yet here you're listing 54 allegations of him having sexual relations with people that weren't his wife. So I just want to make sure we're really clear what you're doing here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. As I said, when I uploaded this, I had some second thoughts because just looking at it, people will say, well, some of them are going to be true. Joseph was a womanizer. But there are some important points to make as you look at it. First off, I had to look at all of these if I was going to be comprehensive. You know, when I started this project, I wanted to see every bit of dirt and every bit of positive on Joseph Smith, because how are you going to know where the truth is? And so you analyze every bit of evidence that comes through. And one important point is that there's only one of these things published in Joseph's lifetime up to 1842. Only one. That's an important observation. And see, after he died, there is a desire among the people who don't believe in Mormonism to try to vilify him or to incriminate him in any way they can. And so what you find is after Joseph's death, all these people are generating all these recollections and things, and you try to put them together and they're going different directions and they're contradicting each other. And that's really what we have. But the 54 of them, if you look at how I broke them down, there are 25 that he was sexually involved with non-wives, but it's curious that we don't have any firsthand reports of a woman saying Joseph seduced me among them all. There's not a single one. We also have on the chart, for those that are looking at it, 9 reports of polyandrous sexuality, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. There's 16 reports of just proposals, immoral proposals, which could have just been discussions of plural marriage that women are sensationalizing, saying, oh, he wanted to have sex with me, when all it was a sealing perhaps for eternity, and we'll talk about that. And then 4 of them come about Fanny Alger, and we've already mentioned how there is evidence for adultery there, but there's also better evidence, in my view, that it was a plural marriage. So I've just tried to be comprehensive. Then go all the way over to the right-hand column, and this is a very subjective thing, but I put there credibility scores. Now, that's Brian Hales' version, and people may disagree, but I just don't think any of them on a scale from 1 to 10 rise above maybe a 4. And those we've already talked about, the one, and they're all just not very credible. But again, I put them out there. If people want to disagree with me, fine. I'm not afraid of what they're going to conclude. Let them look at it. Let them draw their own conclusions.
And again, your main point here is that at least while he was alive, he did not have a reputation as a womanizer, at least in print. Is that right?
Well, and I can't find anything privately written either. I mean, it just doesn't exist there. You know, if people want to say he had a reputation like Gerald and Sandra Tanner wrote, I'm just saying it's not supported by any documentation, public or private, that I can find prior to John Bennett writing all of his stuff.
Okay, and of course, some would say John Bennett had an axe to grind because he was excommunicated and kicked out.
Yeah, we're going to talk about him. He's one of the myths.
Okay, all right. So, and what was the one published report before 1842?
It was the Levi Lewis claim that he's quoting Martin Harris, that Joseph tried to seduce Eliza Winters.
And we talked about that last episode. Yeah. But for those who didn't hear that, what was it for you that made that a little bit dubious?
Well, Levi Lewis is not the best source, because in the same paragraph he tells us that Joseph didn't show the golden plates to anybody, and we know we have testimony from 11 people that he did. But then you also look at the Book of Mormon
even says that, right?
Right. It's in the testimonies that they have in there. Well, yeah, and there's chapters that talk about it happening too. But then if you look at Martin Harris, it just doesn't seem real plausible that he would see Joseph trying to seduce Eliza, and then Martin Harris would continue to be this devout missionary telling people Joseph was a prophet. And then you look at Eliza, and Eliza had 2 very good opportunities to repeat this allegation and didn't do it, didn't even mention it.
Eliza
Winters.
So she never made that accusation herself.
Correct.
And that person who published it claimed he was quoting Martin Harris.
Right. It's not even a first-hand accusation.
And you would wonder if Martin Harris would have been down with that.
Right.
Okay. And people are going to argue that. Some people like to make Martin Harris out to look like a buffoon, and I have no way of knowing, what Martin Harris was like. But, I think you're making some fair points that deserve consideration. What's this other table that comes before Myth 2?
This is a table from an article that is just barely published in Mormon Historical Studies. Just came out last week. And what I did is I followed the 35 plural wives, and I take Todd Compton's 33, and I add two more, Esther Dutcher and Mary Heron. And I followed them after the martyrdom to try to figure out, okay, what did they do? Did they strike out against Joseph? Did they, claim he'd abused them? And frankly, 25 of the 35 made it to Utah. And there they apparently, according to Todd Compton's biographies, they remained active in the church. We have three of them, actually four of them, that die apparently in the faith before they make it to Utah. So that leaves six more. And of those six, five of them joined another church. And then one of them, we just don't know. We lose track of her. That's Lucinda Pendleton. But the interesting observation is that of these 35 women, none of them wrote an expose. None of them left any criticism of Joseph Smith, saying that he'd abused them, that he treated them like chattel, that it was all about sex. Nothing like that exists in any of the writings that we have from these women. And I just thought that was an interesting observation, because if any of them, after they'd remarried, after they'd had experiences with their new husbands and everything, if any of them had looked back to say, Joseph was just a womanizer, at least some of them, especially those who left the church, you might have expected them to have struck back because they felt abused and left some negative recollection. But it's just not there that I've been able to find.
And that's something even Brigham Young can't claim, right? Because he did have wives who divorced him and wrote exposés, right?
That's a very good observation, John. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah. Is that true?
Yeah, because we already quoted Annie Eliza Webb Young and her books.
Right. Okay, that's myth number one. Anything else about myth number one?
Nope. I think he had a pretty clean reputation as far as sexual morality goes up until Nauvoo. And
you do have to ask how he would have amassed such a loyal, devout following, willing to die and traverse, frozen plains, to pursue their beliefs, how he could have engendered such loyalty if there was lots of evidence for him being, sexually immoral, I guess.
Well, and I've done a little reading on Jim Jones and Vernon Howell, Jim Jones of Jonestown, Vernon Howell of Waco. And because people will compare Joseph to them, people get a lot of religious power and then their sexuality goes bonkers on them. And it's very different. Joseph Smith established in the Book of Mormon that sexual immorality was next to murder. And yet Jim Jones, Vernon Howell, these guys were just having sex with anybody because they could. And there was no attempt to maintain a moral standard. And yet with Joseph Smith, you've got this standard set up and nobody's complaining that he's breaking it at all until you get some of the anti-Mormon stuff way late in Nauvoo, just a year or two before he's martyred. So I don't find a good parallel between Joseph and men like that.
And if anyone can find any historical evidence to counter what Brian's saying, we invite you to post it at mormonstories.org and, we'll respond, or Brian will respond, or whatever.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Like I say, let's get the evidence out there.
Okay, myth number two.
Joseph Smith, Fanny Alger relationship was not a plural marriage. And you'll see I've just put my chart there from our last interview. And for those who didn't listen to it, I'm going to leave that discussion to that interview. We won't repeat it all here, but there's evidence that it was adultery. There's evidence it was a plural marriage. I think the evidence it was a plural marriage, including the new discovery that Don Bradley made regarding Eliza R. Snow declaring in her own handwriting that she was a plural wife. I think that's significant and makes it very easy for me to believe that they saw themselves as plurally married and it wasn't just some tryst that Joseph was involved with.
And again, we can talk about this later, but I think what makes people really concerned about Fanny Alger is, again, that, they don't find a revelation for for plural marriage until I think you said 1843, and he didn't tell Emma, and apparently he was, if it's true, he was caught in the barn with Fanny. Now tell me if that's true, and if people have cause to be alarmed by sort of the way that it was discovered that Fanny, and the fact that he hadn't told Oliver, if it was true that Joseph felt like he was operating under some type of divine law, that the people closest to him, not only Emma, but Oliver and others, weren't clued in on it. You got to admit that's a problematic scenario for Joseph to be in, right?
Yeah, it is a problem. If we recall, Mary Elizabeth Rollins, if you want to believe her account, said that the angel came in 1834. And so the way I would construct it, the angel shows up and says, we want you to practice plural marriage. And Joseph is going, and we have accounts that he argued with the angel, that he got the Book of Mormon out and showed the angel the Book of Mormon saying, look, it's condemned here, and how he pleaded with the angel. Whether that was the first visit or the second or the third, we don't know for sure, but the angel is actually commanding it, if you believe that, in 1834. So you can see where his compulsion comes, rather than the common notion that he just wanted to have sex with her because she was apparently a very pretty lady and she was young. But there is another version, and that is the angel commanded it. And so he's trying to figure out how to make this work, and he stumbles with it. He should have talked to Emma, tried to get her involved early on. In retrospect, certainly that's what I think Joseph Smith would have agreed with. But instead, he goes secretly to Levi Hancock, and there's some other dealings because Levi wants to marry Clarissa. And he helps broker that, though they were already in love. And then Levi brokers the discussion with Fanny and performs the marriage ceremony. This is done without Emma's knowledge, and whether the angel had weighed in on whether he should do it that way or some other way, my guess is there was no input, that Joseph just made his own decision that turned out in the end to be the wrong way to handle it. And if I'll be honest with you, in all of my research, John, the only question I can't adequately answer is, why did God command it? I can understand, and we'll talk about it in a minute, why it was needed in Joseph's theology. But why God commanded it, I don't understand it. And why he would have commanded Joseph at that time, I just don't get it. That's the one question I haven't been able to adequately answer.
Don't you wish he had been up front with Emma from the start and been up front with Oliver from the start, though?
Well, he probably was caught between the angel and Oliver. He probably did broach the topic with Oliver enough to know that Oliver wasn't going to go for it. He may have done the same with Emma. In fact, you could certainly imagine he would do that. But upon learning that neither of them was going to support it, plan B could be, well, the angel's making me do this. So he goes forward and tries to do it, clandestine. And that doesn't work out. And that's why I think, even though he had the sealing authority in 1836, he didn't use it for 5 years. See, I read into that Joseph didn't want to seal any kind of a marriage because he knew they'd ask about plural marriage. So I see in Joseph's behavior after Kirtland, after this blows up in his face, him not wanting to re-enter polygamy. And so the angel has to come again a couple more times to really get him to get involved.
And just two more quick things. You mentioned that in 1831 is the first indication that Joseph believed in plural marriage. Is that right?
Yes, it's a late recollection from W.W. Phelps. It's written in 1861, and he remembers a revelation given in 1831, and he remembers it very literally. So we're wondering about whether he had written it down and he's just copying it. He sent it to Brigham Young, but in that revelation is the one about you should take wives of the Lamanites, and we later find out, just like Abraham took Hagar, would be plural wives.
And okay, and then the only other thing that's a little bit problematic for some, and we talked about this in the last podcast as well, is that Joseph apparently didn't claim to have received the keys of sealing until 1836, which would have meant that when he did enter into a relationship with Fanny Alger, even if he felt like he was doing it under God's approval or by an angel's death threat, it's still there's no way to really perceive it as an attempt at an eternal marriage or celestial marriage, because he hadn't received those keys yet. So it
Yeah.
would have been a plural marriage, but for time only in your interpretation.
Yeah, yeah, it would have been strictly obedience. And again, that's the one question that's hard for me is why did God command it not just of Joseph then, but why in Nauvoo and then why in Utah? It brought so many problems. Now, I have some partial answers for it, but it just seems like, life was hard enough and getting the church established was hard enough. And though it did bring the saints together, it certainly brought a lot of persecution on. And
Right.
that's just a puzzler for me.
Okay. Let's go to myth 3.
All right. Myth 3 is that Joseph Smith's polygamy was all about sex. There's a book written not too long ago, and that's a quote right out of it. Joseph Smith's polygamy was all about sex, or in other words, multiply and replenish the earth. In fact, and if we go to the next slide, Joseph Smith gave 3 reasons for plural marriage. They're all found in section 132, but he also talked about at least the first 2 independently. We have other witnesses who remember him talking about it. And the first was simply to restore Old Testament polygamy as a restitution of all things, Acts 3:21. Now, the second reason is to provide righteous families.
Real quick about that. A lot of people say, no. Christ came to fulfill the law of Moses. He got rid of an eye for an eye and the 10 commandments in the sense that they were replaced with love God and love man. Why the need to restore everything? Why not, what about Christ replacing the old law? I guess that's a huge topic, but any quick answer on that?
Well, actually, yeah.
Because he wasn't bringing back, animal sacrifice. He wasn't bringing back, a lot of those, don't eat shrimp and shellfish. So it wasn't a restoration of all things, right?
Correct. But in answer, probably the easiest answer is that Abraham, of course, didn't live under the law of Moses. He lived the gospel, ostensibly the same gospel that was lived in the New Testament. But Abraham, Jacob, Moses not Moses, but Abraham and Jacob lived the higher law, the full gospel. And that is what actually Joseph needed to restore, not the law of Moses version, which allowed plural marriage, but did not encourage it. The law of Moses didn't.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that even by the time we hit Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they're living a higher law in your view.
Right. And there's a few scriptures we could pull in to show that they had the same gospel as Paul was preaching, and yet they were allowed plural marriage. So you're questioning whether New Testament saints were allowed to do it. There's certainly no evidence that they did.
Okay. All right. So restore Old Testament polygamy. What else?
The second one is to provide righteous families for premortal spirits. In other words, multiply and replenish the earth. Joseph did teach this. It's in section 132 and this is probably the best answer that I would tell people if they say, well, why did God command it? Well, it would be because they wanted to jumpstart some of the families and the offspring that were coming into the church. But we haven't done the study to determine whether these plural wives really brought more offspring than if we'd have just been living monogamy. I know they've done some of that in some specific areas, but I don't think anything's been done church-wide. One study suggested that a plural wife in Utah would have about 6 children, whereby a monogamous wife would have 8. So you look at a community and say, well, there's no spinsters here. Everybody's having children. So does that produce more children than monogamous society of having more kids per wife, but also with the number of women who are unmarried in that community. So those are things we don't know, but clearly Joseph taught that we needed to have plural marriage to provide devout families for these premortal spirits.
And is it meant in point 2 that you're going to there weren't enough righteous families to go around, and so we needed these spirits to come through a smaller set of families that would be more righteous? I mean, it's almost indicating that there weren't enough righteous men.
Well, and it even gets worse than that, because the more wives and children you have, the less time that the father has to spend with each of his offspring. Right. So there is some irony in that. But again, I'm speculating beyond just the fact that he said that multiply and replenish is one of the reasons. Okay. And he did tell 1 or 2 people about how there are premortal spirits that need to come down to these families. So
okay, all right. So we're talking about his reasoning.
Right. in my book, I talk about other reasons that have been put forth. We don't have time for that, but some of them are kind of entertaining. But these are the ones that go back to Joseph Smith. And there's only 3 that I found. And the third one is one that's taught very plainly in section 132, but it's not one that we really talk about. And ironically, it is the most important in my view. And that is simply to allow all worthy women to be sealed to an eternal husband, making them candidates for exaltation. If you go to the next slide, what we have is this is the course, one eternal round of the plan of salvation, where we began as spirit children of heavenly parents. We go to the earth as a probationary state, then into the spirit world and judgment and resurrection. And then only couples that live worthily are able to be exalted to the top of the celestial kingdom. The others remain separately and singly without exaltation in their safe condition to all eternity. And what this requires, though, when Joseph Smith revealed that exaltation occurs only to couples, and by that I mean there's no single men, no single women in Joseph Smith's highest heaven. They just aren't there. And so once you reveal that, you've either got to have equal numbers of worthy men and women, or you got a problem. And apparently he anticipates that there would be more worthy women than men. That's the second slide there. And so these women need to have a husband to be sealed to an eternal spouse. And so that's what polygamy allows to have happen, is that these single women can be sealed to a husband and be exalted in Joseph Smith's theology. And I'll just tell you up front, I don't think every man in the celestial kingdom is a polygamist. I don't think there's enough women to go around. I don't think that every woman's going to have to share her husband in eternity. I just don't see that being part of the theology. But I think we can see from this reasoning that this type of a teaching needs to exist. The minute that you say exaltation occurs to couples, you've got to either have equal numbers or make arrangements for there to be equal men, or to be excessive men or excessive women. And in this case, the only option is excessive women with polygamy, which we call polygyny.
Okay. Now, this is totally off topic, but is the arrow going back down to heavenly parents, indicating this idea of theosis, that the exalted couples become gods someday and then have their own spirits? Are you trying to tie that around as if the church is kind of still teaching the idea that we can become gods and father our own planet someday?
Oh, yeah. In fact, I had an article in the Journal of Mormon History, I think it was summer, fall of 2012, where I talk about spirit birth and this whole concept, because there's been a traditional view that basically Brigham Young taught it, but Joseph Smith didn't. And I disagree. I find in a number of places during Joseph's lifetime this teaching popping up, and some come right from Joseph Smith. And so I believe he taught that exaltation is where we eventually become like our heavenly parents, exalted, and in some way we give birth to our own spirit offspring, who then can become heavenly parents. It's the course is one eternal round, which is an interesting statement because it's not in the Bible that God's course is one eternal round, but it is in the Doctrine and Covenants, and it is in the Book of Mormon. Right. So,
but isn't this when President Hinckley was asked about this, he said, "I don't know that we teach it. I don't know that we emphasize it." Isn't that the same doctrine that he seemed to be distancing us from?
Well, he was talking to unbelievers, and I don't mean that as a criticism, but that was the primary audience there, and he knew they weren't going to accept it. And Joseph Smith was warned in 1830, you don't give meat to those who need milk because they'll perish. There was nothing positive to be gained by talking about it. And even John, in this forum, you'd have to ask ourselves, is this really, do we have any milk drinkers out there? And if they perish, am I, Brian Hales, going to be responsible because it's just too much? But I think that's all that it was. If you look at the new Lorenzo Snow teachings of the Church President's Manual for the Relief Society and the High Priests, that statement is in there and it's discussed. It's the focus of a whole lesson.
Well, I don't want to totally derail us, but I mean that some would perceive that as misleading. Then that kind of statement. Do you think that would be a fair sentiment to feel like that's a little bit misleading? But I'm not don't feel like I'm trying to make you call the prophet a liar or anything. I'm just, can you see how some people see that as deceiving a little bit? Well,
sure. But again, he's caught because he doesn't want to give meat to those that are milk drinkers. So you try to use veiled language, and it's not part of this discussion, but we probably should address, Joseph did deny polygamy publicly while he was practicing it privately. And that's one of the big things people have problems with Joseph Smith and what was going on there. But I just see it as the same kind of a thing where you throw the meat out there, it's just going to come back and bite you, Mm-hmm. And so they're trying to do everything they're supposed to, and it becomes very difficult.
And it's tricky because you want to think that we're always going to be totally honest and upfront about everything. So that's a stickler for some people. And I guess as an interviewer, I just want to be fair about these things as they come up. But I hope I haven't derailed us too much. Let's go to the next.
No, it's a good comment.
Okay. So the next slide.
Well, the revelation on celestial and plural marriage indicates that Joseph Smith's polygamy is not about sex. It's about eternity. It's about allowing all worthy women to have a spouse. And it's very plainly taught in Section 132, but ironically, it wasn't really spoken about much during the 19th century, primarily, I think, because it tells about why plural marriage is needed, but not why it is commanded. Mm-hmm. See, they were supposed to live it as an item of obedience, and yet when you teach this kind of doctrine, it shows you plainly that not everybody's got to be a polygamist, and that wasn't a message the leaders wanted to send. And so I think we've just kind of ignored this, and yet as you read Section 132, it comes through loud and clear.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I don't know if you're going to touch about this later in one of the myths, but I think Joseph's desire to seal all of humanity together in one large family, it feels like that has to be factored in to this concept of celestial marriage and polygamy and sealings. It feels like there's more to it than sex, even for someone who thinks sex was probably a part of it. Do you see that sort of sealing and almost the dynastic teachings as being a part of this whole thing in some way?
I would agree. In fact, it's pretty amazing when you think about how if we follow our theology, and let me just add, John, that Fawn Brodie talked about how Joseph had this conscience and couldn't just go out and do polygamy, so he created this grand theological edifice to justify it. I so wholeheartedly disagree with Fawn Brodie on this. See, in the Old Testament, Abraham and Jacob, they practiced plural marriage. Abraham was a friend of God. Clearly, this is not a sinful behavior. And neither one of them, none of the polygamists in the Old Testament gave us any theological justification at all. There is no theology of marriage really in the whole Bible, but especially in the Old Testament. And so when Joseph Smith, if he had wanted to just do polygamy, all he had to say was, they did it. I'm a prophet restorer. I'm restoring it. That's the end of the discussion. He didn't have to give us eternal marriage. He didn't have to give us any of this stuff that is shown in those diagrams. None of that needed to come out at all. And for Fawn to say that he did it to assuage his conscience is nonsense. All he had to say is, they did it, I'm restoring it. End of discussion.
Unless he didn't feel like they would buy it. That it would need to have a revelation for them to buy it, right?
Well, he could have had a revelation, but it could have been a very short one saying, look, they did it and I'm doing it. But instead, what we get is eternal marriage. See, when Joseph Smith asks the question, why polygamy in Section 132, we get the Lord says, we're going to give you a new and everlasting covenant. And then the revelation talks about authority. I mean, here we are heading off in the North 40 here. Well, what's authority got to do with polygamy? Well, it becomes plain because one man controls that authority. And then God gives us 4 examples. He says, if you make an agreement, but it's not by the right authority, then it's not valid. And then he gives us a second example that if you have a marriage and it's not by the proper authority, then it is not valid. In fact, he says then that people who are not married by the proper authority live singly and separately in their saved condition through all eternity. And then he gives us a third example where he says you can even use the right prayer and you can be sincere and you can have a tradition, but if it's not by the authority of the one man, it's not valid. And then the fourth example is verse 19, where a man marries a wife, live worthily by proper authority, and they become gods. And so you're asking, well, what's that got to do with your original question of polygamy? Well, it's establishing this huge theology that I argue Joseph did not have to concoct if all he wanted to do was practice polygamy. Right. Now, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, so there's a chance that he elaborated a big theology to justify sex, but anyone who claims that it was only about sex is probably missing a lot of data that suggests that for him it was about whether or not it was about sex or to what extent it was about sex. It was also about his love for all mankind, his desire for inclusion, his desire for everyone to be sealed together into one big, large family that can all return to Heavenly Father, in his view. And you do get a sense that he just loved people, that he was pained about the risk of his father not being in heaven with him, that he was wondering about Alvin, and that on his mind, just sincerely within his heart, is this desire for everyone to make it back if possible. I guess that's my interpretation a little bit.
No, I think it's great. His most darkest hours were when he was alone. He hated to be alone. He was very gregarious. He loved to be around people. And the chain of belonging that Sam Brown talks about, this chain back to Adam, is the Church of the Firstborn. I mean, you've got to be in that chain, or you're not a candidate for exaltation, as I understand his theology.
So it was about a lot more than sex. If it was about sex, it was about sex plus a lot of other things. If it was about sex at all, is kind of what I'm hearing you say.
Well, sex was part of it. Multiply and replenish was part of it. And I don't actually have it in here, but I've got evidence. It's on the website that he consummated 12 of the marriages with possibly 3 more. But I would argue that sexual relations were not common. And that brings us into the next myth.
Okay, next myth.
The next myth is Joseph Smith had no children by his plural wives. And if you go to the next slide, what I've done, and this is an older slide, I actually have 18 on the bottom part, but I've identified 2 children to Joseph's plural wives. One is Josephine Lyon, and there's a whole chapter on this relationship in my book. But what happened was Josephine's mother, Sylvia Sessions, her husband, Windsor Lyon, was excommunicated in November of 1842. Joseph was sealed to her after that, and she ceased conjugal relations with Windsor. And then she became pregnant, and she delivered Josephine on February 8th of 1844. And what's interesting is that they've done DNA testing, which is very difficult to verify the paternity of a daughter. But Hugo Perigo has done this, and there is a correlation between Sylvia and Joseph's lines. The problem is there's cross-marrying before them. So in Hugo's words, we're just never going to know, at least from genetic testing, whether or not Josephine for sure is Joseph's daughter. I believe the evidence is very strong, but not everybody agrees. Then there's a second child to Olive Frost, and we don't even have enough data to know the gender of that child because both Olive and the child died before the saints left Nauvoo. And then if you go to this chart, and it's also on the website, and it's expanded in my book, but I've identified 18 different individuals who somebody somewhere said are the children of Joseph Smith. I analyzed them all. I don't think any of them are believable. Hugo Perigo's done DNA testing on 6 or 7 of them to show they aren't. But it looks like if Joseph was in the same vicinity when some of these women got pregnant, they were going to blame the child on him. And of course, there are people outside of the church that are very willing to believe that story. But when you get into it, it's just the evidence just is not that convincing to me.
And what is your point here? Because some would say you're arguing that there wasn't a lot of sex, but then you're also saying that there were children. So I guess you're just trying to say Joseph Smith had no children by his plural wives, but why is that an important point?
Well, it's important because I think I've heard people say, well, Joseph had no children. And see, that was the position of the RLDS Church for decades, that Joseph had no children. That's the evidence that these were not sexual relationships. So we're addressing that particular issue. But I also am saying that some of these women were very fertile. Sarah Ann Whitney remarried after the martyrdom. She was pregnant in 3 months and had like 7 children. Lucy Walker, very similar, pregnant in less than 3 months. Melissa Lott, Emily Partridge. Anyway, these women were very fertile, and you would argue that if Joseph was having a lot of sexual relations, there would have been more children. And we just can't find them, and we've looked pretty hard.
Okay, so you're saying there was some sex, but not a whole lot.
Right. Well, Joseph had a hard time. You see, Hiram Smith and William Law. William Law was second counselor in the first presidency. Hiram Smith, his brother, associate president and church patriarch, neither of these men learned about plural marriage until the middle of 1843. So if Joseph is gallivanting around from bed to bed to bed, he's doing it without his brother even knowing about it.
Or his wife.
And then his wife found out. Yeah, exactly. And then Emma finds out in middle of 1843. So does Hiram, and so does William Law. But once Emma finds out, she's got spies out. We've got a couple of quotes where she's sending people out, and she's looking, and she's trying to prevent this. She's just having trouble with it. So to say that he's going from place to place and nobody's picking up on it, it's a little less plausible, I think.
Okay, let's jump on to myth 5.
All right. Joseph Smith had sexual relations with 14-year-olds. Quite a number of authors have either implied or stated very plainly that this occurred. There's only two 14-year-old wives. One is Nancy Winchester, and she may have been 15 when she was sealed to Joseph, but the chronology would support 14. Helen Mar Kimball was 3 months shy of her 15th birthday. And let me just say here that a 14-year-old wife in Joseph Smith's day was eyebrow raising. It wasn't scandalous, but it wasn't normal. If people say, oh, yeah, 14-year-olds were getting married all the time, that's just not true as far as the evidence that I have seen. But the question still comes up, what about Helen Mar? Well,
wait, repeat again. What's the no evidence on Nancy again? Nancy Winchester?
We do not know anything really about her other than she was sealed to the prophet at some time. There is one or two sources on that, and nothing that talks about their relationship, when it happened, or what brought it up. Okay. We just know almost nothing about Nancy.
Okay.
But Helen Mar was sealed to Joseph, and the evidence says that her father wanted a connection to the prophet and offered her up like a ewe lamb. That's what Helen called it later on. And people say, well, see, Joseph wanted it. And Joseph was the one who had her Heber C. Kimball, who was Helen's father, do this. But the evidence is not there. That's speculation. All we know is that she was sealed to Joseph. Todd Compton wrote this, and I really like this quote. He said, some conclude that Helen Mar Kimball, who married Smith when she was 14, did not have marital relations with him. This is possible, as there are cases of Mormons in Utah marrying young girls and refraining from sexual relations until they were older. But the evidence for Helen Mar is entirely ambiguous in my view. And, of course, there are people who look at the same evidence and say, oh, yeah, we're sure that it's true. But there is one observation, and it's the next slide here, that I think is important in looking at this, because in 1892, there was a trial going on between the RLDS Church and the Temple Lot Hedrickite Church. And what the RLDS Church said was that, look, we are the natural heirs of Joseph Smith's church in Nauvoo. Therefore, we own the Temple Lot in Independence outright. We're the heirs. We own it. And the Temple Lot is saying, you're not the heirs of the church. And one of the reasons you're not the heirs is because Joseph Smith taught polygamy and you don't practice it. So even though the Temple Lot didn't believe in polygamy, the issue of polygamy in Joseph Smith's lifetime was a big deal. So what they did is they brought people out to Utah in 1892, and they took a bunch of depositions. At that point, Joseph Smith had 9 wives that were still living. And what they did is they called Emily Partridge, who lived in Salt Lake City.
They being who? Who's making these calls?
The Temple Lot defendants.
Okay. And why are LDS church members supporting or participating in this investigation at all? Why are they cooperating?
Well, it's a good question, and there was a lot of animosity between the Utah church and the RLDS church. That's part of it, but it was more than that. They wanted to prove to the RLDS church that Joseph was a polygamist, plus they didn't want the RLDS church to have the Temple Lot. So they were highly motivated, and Wilford Woodruff personally was involved with some of these arranging for people to witness.
So the enemy of my enemy is my friend, basically.
Yeah. There's some irony there too, isn't there?
Okay. All right.
But they call Emily Partridge. She was not a polyandrous wife, and she testified of sexual relations with Joseph as a plural wife. Then they called Melissa Lott. She lived in Lehi, and she also was not polyandrous, and she also testified of sexual relations as Joseph's plural wife. Then they called Lucy Walker, and this is curious because Lucy Walker was not polyandrous, but she lived up in Logan, 82 miles to the north. And she also testified that she was Joseph's wife in the fullest sense. And the interesting thing is that they didn't call Helen Mar Kimball. And Helen Mar Kimball had written 2 books against the RLDS defending plural marriage. She would have been a great witness if she could have testified of been a full wife, meaning with sexual relations of Joseph Smith. They also didn't call the 3 polyandrous wives, Zina Huntington, Patty Bartlett, and Mary Elizabeth Rawlins. And I argue it was because they couldn't testify of having a full marriage with Joseph Smith either. But I think this observation needs to be addressed by those who think Joseph Smith may have had sexual relations with Helen Mar. If that were true, why didn't they just call her to testify in 1892?
Okay, and I'll just put out a call to my listeners. If anybody can provide evidence that Joseph Smith had sex with Helen Mar Kimball, they please provide it. Now, of course, none of us know who Joseph Smith didn't have sex with. But I think it's just fair to say that if people are going to make those type of allegations, it's responsible to have data to back it up, right? And your point is there are no data to indicate sexual relations between Joseph and Helen Mar Kimball, right?
Now, Helen Mar wrote a poem in 1881 that's really ambiguous, and I agree with Todd with respect to that. But I think this is a new observation that I think needs to be addressed. I think it shows that Helen Mar wasn't sexually involved, or they'd have called her. But again, what else there is ambiguous.
Okay. All right. Well, that's interesting. Myth 6.
Okay, this is John C. Bennett. We talked about him earlier. He shows up in Nauvoo in 1840. The 12 are out of town. He ingratiates himself to Joseph. He lives with the Smith family for 39 weeks. And some say, see, we're pretty sure during that time Joseph and John Bennett had conversations about plural marriage. There's no evidence of that, but there's an assumption there that seems pretty some the people are willing to make. However, Bennett and Joseph undoubtedly experienced many personal conversations during that time, but polygamy would not have been discussed because Emma Smith, the prophet's wife, was not made aware of the practice until 1843. So I don't think that's a very strong supportive evidence. And then on April 8th, 1841, Bennett was presented as the assistant president until President Rigdon's health should be restored, which occurred 2 months later. So people are saying, look, if he's going to be an assistant president, we're sure he knew about polygamy. Well, records indicate that Bennett never met with Joseph Smith or other church leaders. Meetings were held by members of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 many times in the months following, but Bennett was not invited to any of those gatherings. He did nothing ecclesiastical so far as the records of the church indicate. But what's really important is the prophet successfully kept his own brother, Hyrum Smith, unaware until 1843. See, Bennett left in 1842, and we're saying, well, Joseph couldn't have kept him out of the loop. Well, he kept his own brother and William Law out of the loop for a full another year later. So again, not a strong argument. But and then John Bennett identified 5 of the wives of Joseph Smith. He identified Louisa Beeman, Prescindia Huntington, Agnes Coolbrith, Patty Sessions, and Elizabeth Durfee. And some people see Joseph must have told him that. Well, he could have got this information from other people. Also, Bennett mentioned 2 other women that we haven't been able to identify. I think he was just wrong, but we don't know. But I think the source of this information was Nancy Rigdon. Bennett had served as her personal physician, and Joseph did propose to Nancy. But Bennett was very close to Nancy and had published the letter that Joseph wrote to Nancy on happiness. So the argument that Joseph must have been the source of that information is just, I don't think, very strong. But then when you look at the writings of both individuals, Joseph Smith taught that he was restoring Old Testament polygamy. Bennett didn't mention it. The angel with the sword is Joseph, but not Bennett. That there was a ceremony always required with Joseph, but not Bennett. Priesthood required, worthiness required. It was a genuine marriage with Joseph. With Bennett, it was just a one-night stand. There was an eternal relationship. Anyway, there's just no similarity between what Bennett was teaching privately and what Joseph was teaching privately. It seems that Bennett had known of Joseph's teachings. He would have just simply exploited those instead of coming up with his own nonsense. But the real important evidence is that in a letter to the Iowa Hawkeye written in October of 1843, Bennett admitted he did not learn of eternal marriage while in Nauvoo in 1840 to 1842. He said, this marrying for eternity is not the spiritual wife doctrine noticed in my expose, the History of the Saints, the book that he wrote, but is an entirely new doctrine established by special revelation. The spiritual wives for time and the celestial wives for eternity. Well, the problem with this is that Joseph Smith never taught plural marriage except within the context that those marriages could be eternal. So for Bennett, in my view, for Bennett to say, I did not know about eternal marriage is tantamount to saying I did not know about plural marriage either from Joseph, because he would have known about eternal marriage even before Joseph taught about plural marriage. He was teaching about eternal marriage. And yet Bennett said, spiritual wives for time, celestial wives for eternity. So I just think the preponderance of evidence is that Bennett never once sat down with Joseph Smith to learn about plural marriage. He was an adulterer before he came to Nauvoo. He just continued his adulteries there, was found out, and cast out.
Well, so on this one, you lose me a little bit, and so I'll just try and ask a bit of a follow-up question. If I'm, again, trying to apply Occam's razor in my, ill-informed perspective, I would say what seems more likely is that, we know that Joseph and Bennett were close, or Joseph wouldn't have made him assistant president of the church, right? I mean, that's fair, right?
Yes.
Okay. So they were, and wasn't Bennett was he mayor or president of the Nauvoo Legion? Didn't he have several important official titles in Nauvoo?
Yeah, he was a general in the Nauvoo Legion, and he was the first mayor of Nauvoo. He had gone to Springfield to petition for the Nauvoo Charter and was successful, and that was kind of his reward.
Yeah, so he clearly had Joseph's confidence, and they were clearly close in some ways, and Joseph clearly made him one of the most powerful men in the church for at least a year or two, no?
No, not in the church. He certainly was in the city. But as I said, as you go through and look at the journal entries and the meetings that were held, he's not there. He's not doing anything religious. He performs a few marriages as mayor, just for legal marriages. But he speaks in general conference. That's about the only things we can find him doing. But he's just not present in any of the meetings. Both Val Avery and Linda King Newell, and also his biographer, admit that there's just no evidence that Joseph and him had ever talked about polygamy.
But he was co-president of the church, right?
Well, he was an assistant counselor to the first presidency. And we're not sure exactly what that means, but when you look at the fact that members of the first presidency, William Law, Sidney Rigdon, and the associate president who was higher than them, Hiram Smith, did not learn about plural marriage during this exact same period, then it's hard to say that we're pretty sure that Bennett would have learned it. Does that make sense?
So the only theory that comes up for me is that, Joseph had learned from Oliver that even people close to him might not be okay with this teaching, and that if he were to in fact reveal it, it would cause him a lot of problems. And so he was hiding it from almost everybody. And so what some would claim maybe is that he felt like Bennett would be okay with it earlier because of whatever data he gathered from Bennett. So he let Bennett in early on the plural marriages, maybe even before Joseph's theology was fully developed about plural marriage. And so what if let's just assume that Joseph's understanding that culminated in D&C 132 was still immature by 1840, 1841, 1842. What if Bennett was running off of, number one, Joseph's trust that he wouldn't freak out like Oliver did, and then number two, Bennett was running off of Joseph's earlier theology that wasn't fully formed. And then he was running with it because Joseph was doing it, and he knew Joseph was doing it, and he said, if Joseph can do it, I can do it too. But then Joseph, as he did with Hiram Page and the seer stone, basically throwing down the hammer and saying, hey, there's only one prophet here, he eventually saw Bennett sort of getting out of control and threw the hammer down again and said, no, what you're doing is spiritual wifery. What I'm doing is celestial marriage. That's if I'm putting on my skeptical hat, that's a scenario that seems more likely to me. How does that sound to you?
Well, I don't think the timeline is very supportive of that for a couple of reasons. First off, the first person that we assume Joseph taught is Joseph B. Noble. Joseph B. Noble became a bishop in Nauvoo, but he actually lived across the river in Montrose. And he taught Joseph B. Noble because he ended up marrying Louisa Beeman, who was Joseph's sister-in-law, his wife's sister. And so he's not going to church leaders at that point. Now, the 12 apostles were out of town. When they returned in July of 1841 and in the fall, he grabs them and he teaches them all. So he's trusting the quorum of the 12. But during this period, there's no evidence that William Law or his brother Hiram or I would say John C. Bennett is being taught this. But also, if we carry that timeline clear to the end of 1842, at the end of 1842, Joseph had been sealed to several wives, but there were only 3 other men who had taken one plural wife each, and one of them had died. So you've got Joseph and his wives, and then you've got two other men with two plural wives, and that's all that there is. So the idea that there's these rumors going around during the early part of 1842, I just don't see the numbers there supporting that. But also, and this is really important, Joseph Smith had heard the rumors about John C. Bennett before Bennett had gotten very involved in the church. Now, Joseph knew that rumors aren't always true, so it's not like he's going to say, oh, well, we better not do anything about this. But when he heard the initial rumors in early 1841, just months after Bennett arrives, he sends people off to find out if the rumors are true, and he finds out a few months later that they are true. That he is an adulterer, that his former wife, accused him of breaking up 7 different families. Now, this is an account that was published in the Times and Seasons, so it may not be entirely objective. But there's plenty of evidence that Joseph learned early on that Bennett had a trouble with sexual morality. So to assume that he was going to hand off plural marriage to him, I think is not a real not a good assumption. I don't think that's very likely, especially since he was withholding it from so many others.
And if we applied the same standard to Bennett that you tried to apply to Joseph about his own alleged reputation for sexual impropriety, would you say that the evidence for Bennett being sexually inappropriate is much stronger than the evidence for Joseph?
Well, what we have in the end, and we can use the retrospectoscope by looking back, because we have after Bennett leaves, the Nauvoo High Council tries to clean up the mess, and they call a couple of dozen witnesses, and several of them we have, contemporaneous records talking about how he propositioned the woman and how some of his followers were also doing the same thing. One of the followers paid the woman $2, and his line was, "If we keep it secret, it's okay." And so I think we've got really good witnesses about Bennett being really just adultery. It had nothing to do with plural marriage because there were no marriages. There were no marriage ceremonies. It was just a one-night stand, keep it simple. And that's so different from what Joseph taught from the beginning. I mean, we don't have anybody. Of course, Kirtland and Fanny Alger is disputable, but there's no one in Nauvoo saying that Joseph isn't doing marriages. Everybody say these are marriages. They create a marriage relationship, a husband and a wife, which was completely different from Bennett from the very beginning.
Okay, and so for you, the evidence that Bennett was a scallywag, the contemporary evidence, even the published evidence, is much stronger than the evidence against Joseph that he was a scallywag, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good summary.
Okay, but still, the skeptic in me says it's hard to believe that Bennett didn't know anything about Joseph's polygamy, and yet he just spontaneously erupted with his own version of something that he's calling spiritual wifery, which means that it was more to him than just one-night stands, right? Like, it's hard for me to imagine that he didn't know anything about Joseph's polygamy and that he erupted with spiritual wifery, and that there's absolutely no connection, that those two things happened unbeknownst to each other in a complete vacuum.
Ironically, I believe that's exactly what happened. They ran a parallel course, and then sometime in 1842, Bennett heard wind of it. But an interesting observation, John, is that in the fall of 1841, Joseph Smith gets up on the stand and he says, "If you won't condemn me, I won't condemn you, and we'll all go to heaven together." And from that point on, we can find Bennett using that public teaching as a justification for his sexual tryst with these women. Now, I would argue that if Joseph Smith was teaching him about celestial marriage and patriarchal marriage and eternal marriage, that instead of coming up with spiritual wifery, he would have come up with celestial wifery or patriarchal wifery or something like that. There's just no sign of this. And the term spiritual wifery was actually a term used before it was applied to any non-monogamous marital relationship done under the guise of religion, anywhere in America. You can find the term used before Nauvoo, before Bennett brought it there. He's probably the one who brought it there, but there was no wifery. I mean, there's nothing wifery about what he was preaching at all.
Okay. And for those who want to sort of attribute any of Joseph's revelations to kind of secular contemporary events, they could say that maybe the spiritual wifery stuff got polygamy on Joseph's mind to then lead to what? But that, I'm guessing you're going to find that to be a weak association.
Well, it's people are going to speculate, and they're certainly going to see it in a way that libido is driving the process. From my view, and I think from the view of the Nauvoo polygamist, the angel appeared a second time prior to that first Nauvoo marriage with Joseph and Louisa Beeman, and then and that's actually the driving force. But if you don't believe that actually was going on, then you can spin it any way that feels good to you. So.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting claim, but I respect your your position and so forth. So let's go on to myth number 7.
Myth number 7 is another controversial one. It is that none of Joseph Smith's plural marriages were non-sexual, eternity-only sealings. And what this means is there's a couple of authors, I won't name them, but who have bent over backwards in their books to say that all of Joseph's, or to imply that all of Joseph's marriages were for time and eternity, meaning they could include sexual relations here on earth.
So time means sex, you're saying?
Yeah, essentially it means this life and the next.
Eternity only means no sex for you.
Yeah,
okay.
It's not a marriage during this lifetime. In other words, they could be married to somebody else in this life and then be married to Joseph Smith in the next. Okay. And evidence from the Andrew Jensen paper shows that eternity-only sealings creating plural marriages only in the next life were performed between Joseph and women who were already legally married. And if you go to the next slide there, what this shows is it's the handwriting of Andrew Jensen, and we don't know who he's talking to, some Nauvoo polygamist, but he talks about Ruth Vos Sayers. And her husband was not a member of the church, though he liked Joseph a lot because Joseph stayed there when he was hiding from the Missourians. But the account says that he encouraged his wife to be sealed to the prophet for eternity, but that he himself would claim her in this life. And so this is pretty good evidence that eternity-only sealings could occur. And so to assume that they were all time and eternity is just not a good assumption. I believe that 11 of the 14 women who had legal husbands, that their sealings to Joseph were only for eternity. And in the other 3 cases, in 2 of them, the woman had physically separated from the husband, and so they were only having sexual relations with Joseph. And in the 3rd case, it's Mary Heron. We just don't have enough data. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we get to the other 2 myths.
Why is this myth important?
What's that?
Why is this myth important that it sounds like what you're saying is some of Joseph Smith's marriages weren't sexual?
Right. Well, and that's something that's going to be very dubious to people who are sure libido's driving it. But if we want to understand Joseph's relationships with legally married women, this is a concept that we have to understand. And at least 2 authors have really gone way out of the way to try to make it appear that these never occurred. And so that's kind of why I'm addressing
Okay. So this is important for the polyandry discussion.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Myth number 8.
Myth number 8 is that Joseph Smith's teachings allow sexual polyandry. And this is kind of a myth that I made up because I don't think anybody's even thought about it, but it's important to understanding what's going on here. Yeah. The reason is that there's virtually everybody who's written about Joseph Smith and polygamy has portrayed Joseph as practicing sexual polyandry. Now, what that means is that he would go he'd have sexual relations with the woman, and then she'd go back to her legal husband and have sexual relations. Everybody who portrays Joseph doing this basically are ignoring Joseph Smith's teachings regarding polyandry. And so what Joseph taught is that he says, "Behold, I say unto you that all old covenants have I caused to be done away in this thing. And this is a new and everlasting covenant." Now, at the time, they were talking about baptism. This is 1830 D&C 22, verse 1. But when Joseph asks about polygamy, and then he gets what is now section 132, the Lord says, or the Revelation says, "For behold, I reveal unto you a new and everlasting covenant." So if the new and everlasting covenant causes all old covenants to be done away in Joseph Smith's teachings, there's no way that a woman would have 2 marriage covenants at the same time, even if one were legal and one was a sealing. The sealing would cause the legal marriage covenant to be done away. But what's also important, so anyway, a woman could never have 2 husbands with whom she could lawfully experience sexual relations. Joseph Smith also taught that a woman, after she is espoused in the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, if she shall be with another man, she has committed adultery and shall be destroyed. So section 132 describes 3 polyandrous situations and labels them all adultery, and in 2 cases says the woman would be destroyed. So the point I'm trying to make here is that his teachings would not allow the Fawn Brody version of Joseph Smith's relationship with women with legal husbands.
Okay, really quick. Didn't you say there was not a revelation on baptism in the last interview?
Yeah, I said there was no revelation before they did the baptizing.
Got it.
In other words, the argument you got to have the revelation before you can do it isn't supported.
Okay, and then you're saying here that his statements in the D&C wouldn't have allowed for sexual polyandry based on your interpretation of these scriptures.
Right. I mean, to me, it's very plain that it supersedes all old covenants. So how could a woman have a legal marriage covenant and a covenant in the new and everlasting covenant of marriage? According to these teachings, one would supersede the other.
Okay. I'm just going to go back to something you mentioned earlier. So we have plenty of wives, polygamous wives, saying that Joseph Smith had sexual relations with them, but none of them were polyandrous wives by your understanding.
This is really important, okay, that I make this clear, because I've had people who are very much apologetic and agreeing with me who have misunderstood what I'm saying. So here's the deal. I am saying that at no time is a woman having sexual relations with more than one husband. So even if she has on paper a legal husband and Joseph Smith is a husband, she's only experiencing relations with one of those 2 men. If it's the legal husband, then I'm saying that the marriage is for the next life only, and Joseph really isn't her husband now because it's an eternity only sealing. But in 3 of the cases, Sarah Ann Whitney, Mary Heron, and Sylvia Sessions, all 3 of those women were having sexual relations with Joseph, which means they were not having sexual relations with their legal husbands. Okay, so to say that Joseph isn't experiencing sexual relations with his polyandrous wives would be incorrect in 3 of the cases. But as I mentioned, with Sylvia Sessions Lyon, she had stopped conjugal relations with Windsor after he was excommunicated. In the case of Sarah Ann Whitney,
How do we know that?
Well, and Todd Compton still disagrees with me on that. But if you just look at all of the evidence, I think the evidence supporting that is very strong.
Okay.
But I can tell you there's 2 accounts in the Andrew Jensen paper saying that the 2 were separated. One of them dates it after the excommunication, but also Sylvia told Josephine in 1882 that she was sealed to Joseph when Windsor was out of the church. And Todd Compton just ignores that, saying, oh, that's just cover up. Well, I don't think so. I think we should put it with this other evidence and show that's really consecutive marriages, not sexual polyandry. And in the 3rd case, it's Mary Heron, and we just don't have enough evidence. And I'm hoping somebody out there is going to be able to do more research and help us figure out what was going on in that relationship.
Okay, so for you, either Joseph wasn't having sexual relations with the polyandrous wives, and they were married to Joseph for eternity only, and so the wives were having sexual relations with their husbands, or the wives had sort of left their husbands or stopped having sexual relations with them if they were having sex with Joseph.
Right.
And in your view, would it have been inappropriate for wives to be having sex with 2 men?
Well, it's Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, describes 3 situations where a woman would be having sexual relations with 2 husbands or 2 men. One is a husband and one is another man is the wording that it uses. It describes all 3 of those situations as adultery. And so in my understanding of Joseph Smith's teachings, there's just no way a woman could be lawfully involved with 2 husbands having sexual relations.
Okay, well, that's an interesting position. So we'll leave it to the historians to see if they can disprove you. How's that?
That sounds great.
Okay.
It needs peer review, and I'm anxious to see what happens. So.
Okay, myth number 9.
Myth number 9, we're still on the polyandry question. In fact, we've kind of covered a lot of it, but if you look at the slide here, and the authors, virtually everybody says that he may have or he did. I think I'm the only published author to say he didn't. Certainly, I was 2 or 3 years ago. I'm feeling pretty alone, but just a few observations on this, and we've already covered some of it. But if we look at the individuals involved, we find that none of the husbands, none of the wives, left any report or complaint about it. Joseph Smith did not explicate or defend it. The polyandrous wives didn't report it, defend it, or complain. The polyandrous husbands, importantly, did not report it, defend it, or complain. None of the officiators or witnesses, none of the family members reported it, defended it, or complained. Even the anti-Mormons did not complain about it till 1850, 9 years after it reportedly began. When William Law accused Joseph Smith, and William Law was a polygamy insider, he didn't choose a polyandrous marriage. He accused Joseph with Maria Lawrence that was just a regular polygamous marriage. And you can say, well, these are very devout men and women. They're not going to say anything. But the biggest surprise is nobody's defending it. You can imagine that if this is really going on, you would kind of expect somebody to at least say, well, you're really sleeping with 2 husbands? How does that work? And they would respond, well, Joseph said this. But
they might just not want to talk about it because it's so volatile and explosive, right?
Well, but they're not going to get away with that. I mean, it's weird today. Let's face it. Sexual polyandry is really bizarre. It's very rare in the world. You and I are talking about it right now. Do we think that they weren't talking about it then?
Well, if there was no even record of the marriages taking place, any of the marriages, it seems reasonable that they wouldn't want to try and be defending polyandry. That's like, I could see how that would be the last thing that people would want to be writing about. That's just my quick reaction, but I don't know. You can see that, right?
Well, yeah, I can. Well, to some point, but I mean, can you imagine Zina Huntington's brother, and somebody hears, well, Zina's sealed to Joseph, but she's also married to Henry Jacobs. How does that work? And you can say, well, they don't want to talk about it, but people will ask the same questions in Nauvoo that we're asking today. Okay. I do think it's a little naive to think that they could just brush it off without any kind of explanation.
I could see people not defending it purely because they're not wanting to talk or write about it at all. But what I think is interesting, and this is just me, is that none of the husbands later or the wives are complaining or objecting. That is interesting.
And again, we don't have as much data as we would like, but one other observation that's worth looking at. Joseph married his first polyandrous wife, who was Zina Huntington, on October 27th, 1841. During the next 20 months, we think he married the rest of the 13 for a total of 14 women. Now, we don't have dates for 3 or 4 of them. But isn't it interesting when he finally dictates a revelation on polygamy? If he had been practicing sexual polyandry, wouldn't we have expected him to throw a verse in there authorizing that behavior? And isn't it ironic, if he was doing it, that he describes 3 polyandrous situations and labels them all adultery? To me, that's a puzzler if he's actually practicing it.
Yeah, right. Unless he's just kind of lost it at that point. But I mean, it totally, your position there is going to reflect your biases, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. If we go to the next slide, if you're interested, because Michael Quinn and Todd Compton both responded to my polyandry papers. Quinn at Calgary at Mormon History Association and Compton at Sunstone, and they were very kind, both of them, to do it. Michael Quinn wrote a 70-page, 10,000-word explanation, kind of defending the position. He's absolutely convinced Joseph practiced sexual polyandry. And I asked him for permission to post that on my website. He declined to let me do that, so I've just posted my own response there. But if you're interested in it, you can go to josephsmithspolygamy.com, and one of the buttons there on the left-hand side has Hales Quinn Polyandry, and you can download that if you have additional interest in the evidence involved with it. So,
okay. All right. So myth number 10.
And this is something we hear a lot, that Joseph sent men on missions so he could be sealed to their wives. And there's a lot of anti-Mormons out there that have repeated this over and over. Unfortunately, none of them seem to have actually looked at the evidence. Of the 12 polyandrous wives identified by Todd Compton, 10 were not on missions at the time Joseph was sealed to their legal wives. Of the two possible exceptions, only
Okay,
one.
wait. So 10 out of the 12 polyandrous husbands never served missions.
No, I didn't say that. We have dates for some of these sealings, and the husbands were not on missions at that time.
Okay, so they may have served missions previously.
Sure.
But at the time that Joseph entered into the marriage, it wasn't like he got rid of the husband and then propositioned them. In at least 10
Precisely.
of the 12, that's what you're saying.
Exactly.
Okay, well, that's important.
Well, and then of the two possible exceptions, only Orson Hyde is documented as being on a mission. At the time, his legal wife, Miranda Johnson Hyde, was sealed to Joseph Smith. But we also remember that Orson left with the other members of the 12 over a year before that. So if Joseph is calculating to get at Miranda, he sends Orson off, and then over a year later, he proposes to her. So, the sequence isn't exactly what you might expect if he's just sending men out to get him out of Nauvoo. The other exception is...
well, it could be that it takes a while to get these guys off on missions. But you're saying he was gone and then he waited a year.
Right. Which is just curious. If all he's trying to do is get Orson out of there so he can get married to Miranda.
Why did he wait a year?
Why wait a year? And I see that's a double slide there. You may want to remove it. But
still, it is weird that he's propositioning other people's wives, right?
Well, the one thing that we haven't talked about here is Joseph Smith told Lucy Walker, one of his plural wives, that women would have their choices. And we're going to talk about this in a minute about what about the women who turned him down. But Lucy remembered that women would get their choices in every one of these cases. And all of the evidence that we have, these women are choosing Joseph as their eternal husband. And it's weird. There's no question this is strange. But none of the husbands left any record against Joseph Smith for allowing these sealings. And if Joseph was consistent in what he said, then these women just chose Joseph and for their husband.
Do we know if Orson Hyde complained or was mad or upset?
There is one account. It's not from the best source that he came back and was ticked off, but within 2 months he's being sealed to his own wife. And
the same wife?
A plural wife. And Joseph is the one performing the sealing. So if he was upset with Joseph, it apparently didn't last very long.
But I guess the skeptics could say, well, he was just rewarded with another woman, and that helped ease the pain of losing his first wife.
Well, undoubtedly, the plural wife would have given him hope to have an eternal wife if his wife is sealed to Joseph for eternity. So, sure.
No, but also the skeptic would say he would have another woman that he could be with, and...
Well, and we don't know if Miranda was sealed to Joseph for time and eternity or eternity only. I put her in the eternity only category, but we have 2 sealing dates for Miranda. And it's possible the first one was eternity only, the second one was time and eternity. We just don't know.
But it would have been stand up for Joseph to run this by Orson before he proposed to Orson's wife, right?
It's hard to defend that he would be sealed to her unless she was really pressing it, which there's just no evidence either way with Miranda. We almost know very little about Miranda. She's, for somebody who was pretty prominent in Nauvoo, we know so very little about her. So, but yeah, I think it's weird.
Okay.
And I don't understand it.
Okay. All right. But you raise important points. Okay. The second case, did we already talk about that?
No, it's not that helpful. The second possible case involves George Harris, and he was on a mission in July of 1840, but we don't have any sealing date between Lucinda, his legal wife, and Joseph. And if I had to take one woman off my list of 35, it would be Lucinda. The evidence supporting her sealing to Joseph to me is just not that strong. And as I said earlier, we're dealing with Todd Compton's 12, but I've added 2 more women to the list. Both of them had legal husbands, and it's possible that Mary Heron's husband was on a mission at the time, but we just don't have a sealing date for either one of those marriages. And so we just don't know. They're kind of like George Harris. We just don't know when the woman was sealed to Joseph, so it's impossible to say whether the husband was out of town or not.
Okay. All right. So out of all the polyandrous relationships, you're saying 2 out of the 12 were even candidates of the scenario where Joseph sent the men off in order to marry the spouse. and one of those he waited a year after the guy had left, and so that makes it not totally fitting in that scenario. And then the other, you're saying there just isn't enough data to make anything conclusive. Is that right?
Well, there were actually 4 possibilities, but because we don't have sealing dates for 3 of those women, we just don't know. And then, of course, the 4th one is Miranda that we've talked about.
Okay. Do we know if George Harris complained?
None of these men left any record of complaints against Joseph Smith. Now, a couple of them were sad to learn that their legal wives were sealed to Joseph. Understandable. Henry Jacobs and Albert Smith both left record that they were saddened by that, which is understandable. But neither one of them left a record criticizing Joseph. You have to question why Joseph would allow for these things to happen. But again, it's not immorality; it's just puzzling.
Okay, all right. Myth number 11.
Myth number 11 is that Joseph Smith threatened to destroy the reputation of any woman that turned him down. And this is actually a quote from John Bennett's book. But as I was alluding to earlier, Lucy Walker quoted Joseph saying, "A woman would have her choice. This was a privilege that could not be denied her." So if we believe that actually was in effect, then it would help us understand why these women would choose Joseph, maybe over their legal husbands, at least in some of the cases. We do know that 5 women turned Joseph Smith down: Esther Johnson, Lydia Moon, Sarah Granger Kimball, Cordelia C. Morley, and Rachel Ivins. But the interesting thing is the only reason we know about their rejections is because either they or others who were close to them left late recollections about it. In other words, these women told Joseph no, and there was no retaliation. There was no trying to destroy their reputation. Joseph respected their decisions. In one of the cases, he said, "Well, I will pray for you," and he just moved on. So the idea that Joseph Smith was going to destroy the reputation of any woman who turned him down just is not supported in these 5 cases. However, Joseph Smith's interactions with 2 women, Sarah Bates Pratt and Nancy Rigdon, shows that when they made accusations against them publicly, he would defend himself against that.
But he did. Do you think that did he threaten the women that their souls would be damned if they didn't agree?
No, not that we have any record.
Weren't there some letters written? Sort of I seem to remember something about he's in the attic with the young woman. He hands them a piece of paper, and it basically says, your soul will be destroyed if you don't agree to this, and you've got 24 hours. So I'm totally paraphrasing, but does that, maybe that's just slander or, misinformation. You're not aware of that kind of thing?
Yes. In fact, it's very important. And I should have added this to a myth because it's gone rampant. We've got authors even recently misrepresenting it. Lucy Walker was introduced to plural marriage by Joseph Smith in 1842. We don't know which month it is. Lucy Walker gets majorly depressed. She doesn't give him an answer. She doesn't know what to do. She says life was no longer worth living. Then she tells us that one day in late April of 1843, so we're at least 3 or 4 months out from the time when Lucy Walker is first introduced to it. But in April, Joseph Smith sees how distraught she is. And he says, "Okay, I'm going to give you 24 hours to make a decision. And if you don't, the doors will be shut against you forever." And that night she has a spiritual extraworldly experience. And then the next day she is sealed to Joseph. Unfortunately for everybody, there's been a number of authors who have only told us that Joseph met her and gave her a 24-hour ultimatum. Like, man, she's a hot woman. I want to get in bed with her. So here's the ultimatum, baby. You better accept this and let's get married. That's not at all what happened. Joseph, according to the account, saw her distress and says, "Okay, let's resolve this. You got 24 hours. And she prays that night and has this marvelous experience that convinces her that this is right. And so she goes ahead and she is sealed to Joseph and becomes his plural wife. So I think that's the account that you're referring to. Does that sound right?
Yeah, maybe. But are you aware of him ever sort of threatening the woman with, damnation or some type of lower status in the future worlds if they don't marry him?
Not in a credible document, and maybe I'm missing on something. There were some allegations by Bennett regarding Sarah Pratt, and that may have gone there. There's some things with Brigham Young and Martha Brotherton, but again, if you look at the women, if Joseph were threatening them, you would think that some of them would have later been unhappy with that and left some kind of a record. But Lucy Walker says no, a woman gets her choice, and that's the best record that we have regarding these interactions.
Now, Emma did get the threat in D&C 132, right?
Yeah, I can see why Emma wasn't real pleased with the revelation.
Because in there, what does it say?
Well, it says a couple of things that are important. It says, don't partake of whatever you've been offered. And some people have said, oh, that was a polyandrous relationship with William Law. The problem with that interpretation is William Law later said when he was interviewed that that's just false. There was no truth to it at all. Somebody was making it up. So this idea of William Law and Jane making some kind of a switch is just not credible based on his testimony.
Although he could have been just trying to cover up, past indiscretion. I mean, that's possible, right?
Yeah, of course, anything is, but when you read the way he stated it, it's pretty convincing to my mind. But I just think that she was not supposed to partake of that is just a divorce, that she threatened divorce. We have people telling us that actually had occurred, and they're saying, look, let's keep this together. So,
okay, but what did Joseph threaten Emma with if she didn't comply or allow? Wasn't it pretty severe? In D&C 132? I mean the Lord, if you believe it's the Lord's revelation.
Right. If you believe it's the Lord's revelation, the threat is that it's the law of Sarah, and I could pull it up, but basically that once they are taught the law, and Joseph waited a long time to teach Emma. That was why he waited, I believe, is because once she was taught about plural marriage, if she rejected it, then she becomes the transgressor and she will be destroyed. And that's the threat to Emma.
I have a hard time wanting my God to be threatening destruction of people, but the scriptures have all sorts of difficult things in them. So I guess this wouldn't be the only case of God doing some disturbing things by some people's report, right?
Well, and see, I would read this, and of course, maybe I'm being too nice to the Lord in my read, but I just think by they will be destroyed is describing anybody who is not able to have a continuation of the seeds or who is not exalted. They'll be destroyed in the flesh, and then they are resurrected in the telestial and terrestrial kingdoms. To me, that's all that's alluding to, and so it's actually a merciful claim. This, hey, let's live up to the highest law here and get the highest reward.
You are indeed kind to the Lord.
Okay.
All right, myth number 12.
Rounding it out we're back at Emma now, and some people don't think that she ever supported plural marriage, and I disagree, and the evidence is strong she did. It doesn't appear that she knew of any of the time and eternity plural marriage sealings prior to the spring of 1843, and how she became introduced, we don't know. She may have learned about the eternity-only sealings first and actually had thought that they all were eternity-only sealings, only to learn that they were not. They were also for time and eternity, and that Joseph had been involved with some of these plural wives sexually and not just anticipating the future. But we do have good evidence that in May and June of 1843, she participated in plural sealing ceremonies for the Partridge and Lawrence sisters. And then the night after Emma Smith gave Emily Partridge to Joseph as a plural wife, Emily stayed with the prophet. When asked where Emma slept that evening, Emily replied, "She was in her room, I suppose. I don't know where she was." Well, Emily observed that after that night, Emma never again allowed Joseph to sleep with her. No, sir, never after that first night. She turned against us after that. Emma knew that we were married to him, but she never allowed us to live with him. And so you can see that sharing a husband sexually in polygamy has got to be one of the hardest things, if not the hardest thing. And Emma tried. She gave 4 wives to Joseph, but this is something that it just appears that she couldn't do, even though she was trying very hard. And then you know the story. On July 12th, Hiram says, "Joseph, dictate a revelation. I'll take it to her. We'll convince her that this is legitimate." Well, he dictates the revelation. Emma rejects that and threatens Joseph with divorce. And then part of the story that not everybody knows is the very next day, they send for William Clayton. And there's a big meeting between Joseph and Emma. And William records that Emma demands that some property be deeded over to her, either because if Joseph dies, she'd have this value, or if they get a divorce, that Emma would have something for which she could continue her life from a monetary standpoint. And then the other thing that we observe is that from that point on, Joseph is only sealed to 2 more women. One of those sealings occurs at the end of September, and it's to Melissa Lott. And Melissa left a record that Emma knew all about it. And then the second one is to Brigham Young's sister, Fanny Young, and it's in the context of just an eternity-only sealing if you read the account. So those are the only marriages after this July 13th meeting that Joseph has with Emma. Then what we find is that for the rest of Joseph's life, and this is from like July until his death the following June, they really live outwardly a monogamous lifestyle. And Emma is in the Nauvoo mansion. Some of the plural wives live there with them, but whether or not they're having their times with Joseph, we do not know. But what's interesting, and I kind of wanted to end this with a positive thing regarding Emma, is that as Joseph was leaving for Carthage and martyrdom, Emma requested a blessing at his hand. Now, time was limited, so what he said is write one, and I'll sign it. And so what she wrote was, I desire with all my heart to honor and respect my husband as my head, ever to live in his confidence, and by acting in unison with him, retain the place which God has given me by his side. According to their son Alexander, Emma's final words spoken at her last breath were, Joseph, Joseph, yes, yes, I am coming. So I really read that Emma tried very hard. And I think that while she stumbled and she made Brigham really ticked off, I think that there's lots of mercy for her and that no one should judge her.
All right. Well, we did it. We covered the, I don't know, in your view, 12 myths about Joseph Smith's polygamy. So I want to thank you so much, Brian, for being willing to do this on Mormon Stories. I think you give us, if anything, in my view, the lesson that I've learned from the past 2 podcasts is sort of the lesson about confirmation bias, but that it really does cut both ways. There are people who sort of believe Joseph was, they'll say a fraud, or they're angry at the church, or they're disillusioned, and they're going to be really willing to sort of embrace any information or data or interpretation or rumor or innuendo, whatever they can hear that will justify their position that Joseph was an evil, adulterous, philandering scalawag. And I myself, I think, have been guilty of sort of believing or passing on or perpetuating almost, many things that I've heard as if it were factual without really taking the time to study the historical evidence. And I think it's fair to say, on the other hand, that for those who really want to believe, I think it's fair to say that many of our listeners are going to say that you're very kind to Joseph, you're very kind to the Lord and to your interpretations. And what you're also doing is working hard to support a point of view. But I guess the difference between you and me, and maybe a lot of the, let's just say Joseph naysayers that I know, maybe not all, is that you've definitely dug into the evidence and you're basing your positions on primary sources. And I think that deserves a lot of respect. And I think what you do for sure is you show us that many of us have jumped too early to conclusions that really aren't necessarily strongly supported by evidence. Is that fair?
No, I appreciate that, and I think you characterize my position very well. I personally think that if we just get all the evidence out there, I think Joseph does just fine. There are questions. Why would he allow 14 women to be sealed to him? There are questions. Why was he sealed to 35 wives and things of this nature? But for men and women who paint him as being this philanderer, the evidence just is not there. It doesn't bear out that interpretation, even though there still are some question marks. And so, like I say, the process through which I did this research has increased my belief in him and in his teachings immensely.
All right. So the books are Joseph Smith's Polygamy, volumes 1, 2, and 3, due in bookstores February 26th, through either Benchmark Books, Kofort, or Amazon. For those of you who want to pre-order, you can get a discount, through those channels, at least through 2 of the 3 channels. We also want to encourage you, if you want to meet Brian in person or Don Bradley, his main research supporter, you can go to one of 2 book signings. One is February 27th from 5:30 to 7:30 at Benchmark Books in Salt Lake City, and the other is March 9th at 7 p.m. Pioneer Book in Orem. So Brian Hales, thank you so much again for coming on Mormon Stories podcast. And please check us out for our final episode, where I'm going to be taking a lot of the questions that were posted to the mormonstories.org website and sort of, having Brian not defend polygamy per se, but just to sort of explain, in light of the very tough questions, how he and how the original saints were able to maintain faith in spite of what for many is very troubling. And I hope that that's just very, very much an affirming episode for those who want to remain in the church. Brian might give some tips and tricks on how someone could know all about the Joseph Smith's polygamy and still believe. You still up for that one, Brian?
Yeah, that sounds great, John. Thanks so much.
All right. So please check us out at mormonstories.org to comment, to provide us with any support that you're able to provide. Email us at mormonstories@gmail.com if you have questions. And we just thank you all for listening and hope you tune in again soon. You guys take care.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, Brian.